Hello, welcome to my next Patreon video installment. In this section, in this installment, I'm going to take you through a couple of interesting chapters in Genesis. And this is going to be the last one I do in Genesis because we've done the Abraham cycle, we've done the Jacob cycle. The last part of Genesis, basically starting from Genesis 37 all the way to 50, is in large part the Joseph story. And it's pretty straightforward, and I don't think there's anything radically new I can kind of enlighten you with, except for what we're going to cover today. Now, one of the interesting things in Genesis is that starting in chapter 37 chapter 37 is the famous Joseph and his brother's story with his coat and them selling him into slavery. That's chapter 37. But the interesting thing in Genesis is right after that chapter, which is 37, in 38, we have this seemingly completely unrelated chapter involving another brother, Judah, and his adventures with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And that's in chapter 38. And it's kind of an odd story, which we'll get to today. But then in chapter 39, the scene shifts back to Joseph, and from 39 all the way to 50, it's your standard Joseph story, once he gets into Egypt and all that stuff. And so, scholars have long wondered about chapter 38, this Judah and Tamar story. And some scholars think that it just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. It doesn't have anything to do with the Joseph story. You have chapter 37, Joseph, chapter 38, Judah and Tamar, back to 39, Joseph, and Joseph on out. And so in the past, a lot of scholars have thought that this chapter 38 of the Judah and Tamar story doesn't fit. It therefore is evidence of a later insertion that that interrupts the flow of the narrative and all that stuff. Well, anyway, years ago when I was doing a Hebrew class, my first year Hebrew class, as we were learning Hebrew, the teacher took us through what's going on in chapter 37 and 38. It's kind of a Hebrew exercise, but also a narrative exercise. And long story short, as odd as the Judah and Tamar story is in chapter 39, it really does not interrupt the overall narrative of Joseph. In fact, it's really important. It's a key part of the overall Joseph cycle. And so I'm going to take you through that today. We're going to first go through chapter 37, that famous story with Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And then the Judah and Tamar story. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the narrative that you are probably just highly unaware of. And it is vital to understanding what goes on. It has huge implications for the conclusion of the Joseph story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through these two chapters today. And I'm going to do it by means of my own personal translation. It's basically the same. You could whether you have an NIV or ESV or an NRSV or any other version, it's going to be largely the same. But I wanted to use my version because in my version I make a point to highlight certain linguistical markers that sometimes translations miss, but you see them in Hebrew. So let me tell you a little story, starting in chapter 37. This is the beginning of the Joseph story, and it starts off in chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob settled in the land of the sojourning of his father. He was, lived in Canaan, but he moved around. The father of Canaan, the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, a son of 17 years, was shepherding the flocks with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and to the sons of Zilpah, the wives of his father. Joseph brought an evil rumor about them to their father. Now let's take it right there. Some translations, what I have as evil rumor, some translations have a bad report. Now, depending on how you translate that, that has huge implications for what Joseph is doing. Most translations say he brought a bad report to his father, which would imply that the brothers weren't doing their job or were doing something bad, and Joseph is basically tattling on them. Still not a good thing, but it highlights this tension between Joseph and his brothers. But at the same time, that phrase could also be interpreted as an evil rumor. Still not a good thing, obviously, but the implication with a difference between an evil rumor and a bad report is a bad report is they were definitely doing something wrong, I'm telling on you, which just makes you to be a tattletale. An evil rumor is you're spreading gossip, which may or may not be true. And that kind of reflects poorly, even more so, on the tattler. And so, but right here, you get the very beginning, this first picture you get of Joseph isn't a good picture. In fact, sometimes we're so familiar with the story, we forget how bad of a picture we get of Joseph at the beginning. This first instance being the first case. He's tattling on his brothers with what may or may not be correct information. Moving on to verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because Joseph was a son of Israel's old age. And Jacob even made for Joseph a long robe with sleeves. Now some translations have a coat of many colors. The translation, it could be just a long robe, a long sleeve robe. In any case, it's a special robe for Joseph. In verse 3, you see that, verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and were not able to speak any peace to him. Now, this first paragraph, not only is Joseph tattling on his brothers, we're also told that he is his dad's favorite. Now, anytime in any kind of family, if there is one child who clearly is the favorite child, the other kids are not going to appreciate it. They're going to feel slighted by their parents. And in this case, we're told that Jacob, or Israel, doted upon Joseph, and he was the special child. On top of that, the reason why, and this is kind of an interesting thing, the reason why we're told that Joseph was his favorite wasn't simply because he was the son of Rachel, even though he was. It specifically says, Joseph was a son of Israel's old age. What does that mean? Basically, it means that Jacob fathered Joseph when Jacob was an old man. And this is kind of almost like a macho thing. He was very proud that he could still father children in his old age. So Joseph was kind of like his favorite because of that. He was kind of proud of himself. But in any case, what you get at the very beginning of this chapter 37, as we all know, is this conflict between Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is his daddy's favorite. Joseph tattles on his brothers. And what makes it worse is what comes next. Then Joseph dreamed a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they added even more hatred to him. He said to them, listen to this dream that I dreamed. Now picture yourself in your family, if you have a younger brother or sister who is like this, how would you feel? And this is one of the things, again, we're so familiar with the story, we don't forget how bratty Joseph sounds. This younger son is telling this to his brothers. He said to them, listen to this dream that I dreamed. Look, we were binding sheaves in the middle of the field, and look, my sheaf rose up and stood up, and your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. How would you feel if your younger siblings started telling you these dreams he was having about how your stuff was bowing down to his stuff? Kind of arrogant. Then his brothers said to him, you think you're going to rule over us? You think you're going to govern us? And they added even more hatred toward him because all of his dreams and his words. So your impression of Joseph at this point should be kind of like you want to smack him. He sounds like a bratty little brother. Now, he has another dream. Verse 9. Later, Joseph dreamed another dream, and again he told it to his brothers. He said, look, I dreamed a dream again. Look, the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to me. How many brothers does he have? 11. And when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what's this dream that you've dreamed? Will your mother and your brothers, come to bow down to you on the land, like bow down to you on the ground? And Jacob's brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept quiet about the word. So the scenes about his dreams, not only does he come across as kind of a brat, we're told that even his father gets angry with it over him, but he doesn't do anything. Why? Because Joseph is his little favorite. And so what you see here is this heightened tension within the family, the sibling rivalry, and the father, Jacob, doesn't address it. Even though Joseph is causing tension, he is not kept in check by his dad. And this leads to further hatred by his brothers. So, verse 12, his brothers went out to shepherd their father's flock at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Hey, aren't your brothers shepherding at Shechem? Go, I will send you to them." And Joseph said, "Here I am." So Jacob said to him, "Please, go see to it that your brothers and the flocks are at peace, and then return word to me." What's he asking Joseph to do? Go check on your brothers, make sure they're doing the right thing, and tell me. It's almost like he's encouraging Joseph to tattle on them. So then he sent Joseph from the valley of Hebron. But look, when Joseph came to Shechem, a man found him wandering in a field. So he's just kind of lost. The man asked him, "Who are you looking for?" And Joseph said, "My brothers. Please tell me where they are shepherding." So the man said, "Oh, they've already set out from here. I've heard them saying, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" Now, living in America in the 21st century, that means nothing to us. But in the ancient world, Dothan was kind of associated, and you'll see if you read closely throughout the whole Old Testament. Think of Dothan as kind of like the Vegas of Canaan. And so, what does this tell you about his brothers? They are shepherding their flocks, but they're going to Dothan. They're going to have some fun. And so this doesn't reflect well on the brothers. And so Joseph is going to go out and find them and tattle on them even more. And so he goes. Verse 18, Joseph went off after his brothers, and he found them in Dothan. Yet when they saw him from a distance, before he came near to them, they plotted to put him to death. They were planning to kill him. Each one said to his brother, "Hey, look, the master dreamer of dreams is coming. Come on, let's kill him and throw him in one of the cisterns. We'll say that some evil animal devoured him, some wild animal," but in Hebrew it's actually the word evil. "Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." So they're planning to kill him. But here's where things start to get interesting. Reuben, the firstborn, heard about it, and he rescued Joseph from their hand. He said, "Hey, let's not strike down his soul or shed any blood. Throw him in the cistern in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." His plan was to snatch him away from their hands and then return him to his father. Now, at that point, you have to sit back and think, why would Reuben try to save Joseph's life? And the answer comes, we're told this later, at the end of Genesis, when Jacob is giving his final blessings and words to his family, to his sons. We find out that Reuben was basically in Jacob's doghouse because Reuben had slept with his father's concubine. I think it was Bilhah or Zilpah, but I'm pretty sure it's Bilhah. You don't do that. You don't sleep with your dad's wife. Not only that's bad. And so we are told that here that Reuben wants to save Joseph's life. Why would he want to do that? Because he wants to get back in the good graces with his dad. We learn about his sleeping with his father's concubine, put him in the doghouse. And so now here, Reuben finds a way, if I save Joseph, daddy's favorite, that'll look good on me. That's his plan. But, verse 21, when Joseph came to them, they stripped him of his robe of long sleeves and threw him in an empty cistern without any water in it. When they sat down to eat a meal. Soon they raised their eyes and they saw something. Look, a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were carrying spice, balm, myrrh, and were walking down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "Hey, how does it profit us to kill our brother and then cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and we won't have to lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Judah, not Reuben. Why don't they listen to Reuben even though he's the firstborn? They've lost respect for him because of that thing he had done earlier of sleeping with his father's concubine. And Judah, he becomes kind of like the one they look to as their leader. And this is what Judah suggests. Just sell him to the Ishmaelites and sell him into slavery. And his brothers listened to him. Verse 28. Then some of the Midianite traders passed by, and they pulled Joseph out, lifted him out of the cistern, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And it was the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. Verse 29. When Reuben returned to the cistern, look, Joseph was no longer in the cistern. So Reuben tore his clothes, returned to his brothers, and said, the boy is gone, and where am I going to go? So clearly Reuben was not there when they decided to sell him. And so Reuben's reaction of tearing his clothes is he's realized that they haven't listened to him, and he's not going to be able to save Joseph, and thereby he's not going to get back in Daddy's good graces. So that's his reaction. I mean, if you look at his reaction, when the boy is gone, he doesn't say, what have you done to Joseph? His first reaction is about himself. Where am I going to go? And so this tells you something about the family dynamic here. Because of Reuben's sleeping with the concubine, not only is he in Daddy's doghouse, but his brothers don't see him as their leader anymore. And they turn to Judah, who is the one who recommended him being sold into slavery. So, how are they going to cover this up? Verse 31, they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a male goat, remember that, and dipped the robe in blood. Then they went to their father, brought the robe of long sleeves, and they said, we found this. Please, do you recognize this? Is this the robe of your son or not? Jacob recognized it and said, it's the robe of my son. A terrible beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces. Notice this. The brothers don't tell Jacob anything. They don't. Obviously, they don't say they sold him into slavery. They're not the ones who suggested that a wild beast killed Joseph. They just set up the chessboard, so to speak, and let Jacob's imagination run wild. And they deceive Jacob by dipping the robe in goat's blood and then presenting it to Jacob. And now the phrase is really important. Recognize this. Remember that phrase. And once they do that, Jacob lets his imagination run wild, assumes Joseph has been killed. But then he goes overboard. Verse 34. Then Jacob tore his garments, put on sackcloth over his loins, and he mourned for his son many days. That part is understandable. In the ancient world, if you lose a loved one, there's a time of mourning that you are expected to mourn for the loss. But then, after the time of mourning is over, you are expected to take off your sackcloth and ashes, put your normal clothes back on, and get back to your life. That was expected. But look what Jacob does. Verse 35. And his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, I will go down to Sheol mourning for my son. So his father wept bitterly for his son. Jacob's reaction to Joseph's seeming death is an overreaction. He refuses to be comforted, and he basically says, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in mourning. That is obviously more than the brothers bargained for. And at this point, they're probably regretting what they've done, and you'll see this. At the end of this chapter, it says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, captain of the bodyguard. So that's chapter 37. We have this story of Joseph being sold into slavery. Now, please, again, remember the idea that the way the brothers deceived Joseph is by dipping his robe in goat's blood, by saying, recognize this. And Jacob's reaction is he reads into it the death by an animal, and he refuses to be comforted. And he's going to go down to Sheol mourning for his son. Now, if you were one of the brothers at that point, you're probably thinking, Judah, why did we listen to you? This is more than we bargained for. Hence, the next chapter is all about what Judah does. Chapter 38, verse 1. It was at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside with a man, an Adulamite, whose name was Hira. Basically, Judah says, I'm going to leave you guys for a while. He goes off. He kind of leaves his family because what he did probably wasn't so smart. So he hightails it out of there. And he settles elsewhere in Canaan. Now, Judah, not only is he the kind of guy who will recommend selling his own brother into slavery and covering it up and deceiving his father, which again is much like his father, who is a deceiver. These next few verses tell you something else about Judah. Judah saw there a daughter of a Canaanite man whose name was Shua. Now remember, you're not supposed to marry Canaanites if you're in the family of Abraham. Judah doesn't care. He sees a Canaanite woman and says, I want her. So he took her and went into her. That's really brutish and graphic. The phrase oftentimes in the Bible talks about the sexual union between a man and woman is often, so-and-so knew his wife. That's kind of a euphemism for having sex with his wife. But the phrase is, he took her and went into her, tells you something about Judah. It's basically like he took her and poked her, screwed her, that kind of thing. It tells you what kind of man Judah is. He's not a good guy. But in any case, she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, and he called his name Then she became pregnant again and gave birth to another son, and he called his name Onan. She gave birth again to another son, and she called his name Shelah, for Judah was in Kezib when she gave birth to him. Right there, that last bit. That third son, she names because he's not even around. So he gets his wife, doesn't treat her that well. He's not even there for one of the births. But this is who Judah is. He's a thoroughly disgusting character. And there's more to come. Now Judah took a wife for the firstborn. Her name was Tamar. Now the firstborn of Judah, was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and Yahweh put him to death. We're not told why, but he died. So Judah said to Onan, go into the wife of your brother and do your duty as a brother-in-law. Raise up offspring for your brother. Now, in that culture, that was an accepted practice. If some man died whose wife had not had a child yet, it was the duty of the next in line to take her as his wife, care for her, and then have children in his brother's name, so to speak. Because once you take a woman into your household to marry one of your sons, it's your responsibility, your family's responsibility to take care of her. And so that's what's going on here. So Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So he went into the wife of his brother. He went into the wife of his brother. He ejaculated on the land so that he wouldn't provide offspring for his brother. But that was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, so he put him to death too. Onan basically, he'll have sex with her, but he doesn't want to have kids. And again, that deprives his brother of a lasting name, and it kind of deprives her of having children. So he's abusing her as well. So he dies as well. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law, hey, return as a widow to your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For Judah thought that Shelah might die just like his brothers. So Tamar went and returned to the house of her father. Please note, that is the utter lack of responsibility on Judah's part. It's his responsibility to take care of her because he had brought her into his household. The fact that he sends her back to her father as a widow is completely irresponsible on Judah's part, which does something about him as well. On top of that, we're told, and it will be more obvious later, that he has no intention of giving his youngest son to Tamar. What that effectively does is Tamar, because she has no rights, she's a woman living in the ancient Near East, she's going to have to be a widow for the rest of her life with no chance to get out of that situation. She's never going to get married again. She's never going to have kids because Judah is being irresponsible by not caring for her. Typical Judah. Now after many days, or really years, the daughter of Shua, the wife of Judah, died. But Judah comforted himself by going up to the sheep shearers at Timnah along with Hira, his friend the Adulamite. When Judah's own wife dies, he comforts himself. Remember, this should be seen in light of what happens when Jacob thought Joseph had died. Jacob refuses to be comforted because he loves his son so much and he thinks Joseph's dead. Judah, when his own wife dies, I'm going up to the sheep shearers. Now, him going up to the sheep shearers is another implication for Judah. Again, think back to the previous chapter. When Joseph's brothers are supposed to go out to tend the sheep, they end up in Vegas. They're going to party. It sounds kind of weird, but in the Old Testament, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times when guys go off to the sheep shearers or go off to tend sheep, it often ends up in some, naughty behavior. Not with the sheep. But in this case, you'll see what Judah does. His wife has just died. He comforts himself. He's going to go to the sheep shearers and have some fun. Verse 13. When Tamar was told, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear sheep," she took off the garments of her widowhood, disguised herself by covering herself with a veil, and she sat down by the entrance to Enam, which is on the road to Timnah. She clearly saw that Shelah was now grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. So Tamar is going to take matters into her own hands to try to get her life back. And what she does, on the surface, seems pretty wrong. But at the same time, it's the only option she has. So she goes up to Timnah disguised. Verse 15, when Judah saw her, he assumed that she was a common whore. Now, in Hebrew, most translations don't have it that way. They just say prostitute. But in Hebrew, there are different kinds of prostitutes. You have a zona, which was considered like your common street prostitute, a common whore. A kodesh was considered a sacred temple prostitute. And in that culture, at least that had some legitimacy. Okay? Keep that in mind, the difference between a sacred temple prostitute and a common whore. Judah sees her, his own daughter-in-law, doesn't realize it's his daughter-in-law, and he thinks she's just some street whore. And so he wants some. So what does he do? Verse 16, so he turned aside to her along the road, and he said, "Hey, let's go. I want to go into you." Again, shows what kind of guy Judah is. I just want to do some banging. Basically, that's what he's saying. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give to me to come into me?" So he said, "I'll send something from my flock." But she said, "Only if you give a pledge until you send it." Then Judah said, "Well, what pledge should I give to you?" Tamar said, "How about your seal, your cord, and the staff that's in your hand?" So he gave it to her, and he went into her and got her pregnant. Then she rose up, walked back, took off her veil, and clothed herself in the garments of her widowhood again. Now that little scene is really telling. Judah sees his daughter-in-law, doesn't realize it's his daughter-in-law. He just wants to have some fun. And they discuss payment. And she wants to know what he's going to pay her. And he offers, "I'll send you something from my flock." Now, Tamar knows something about Judah, that he has a tendency to promise things then doesn't deliver. So she doesn't buy that. She wants some payment now. So the very fact that she asks for his cord, his seal, and his staff, in the ancient world, that was basically saying, "Give me your major credit cards and I'll hold on to them until you pay me." Do you give your credit cards to a common street prostitute? Apparently, Judah does. So not only is he a complete heartless brute, he's also really stupid. You don't give your credit cards to a common whore. He does, though, and he gets her pregnant. Verse 20. When Judah sent the young goat, now that's kind of interesting. Remember, the brothers deceived their father with a goat, the goat's blood, with covering up Joseph's selling into slavery. Judah sends a goat by the hand of his friend the Adulamite to take the pledge from the hand of the woman, but he didn't find her. He asked the men there, "Where's the Kodesh? Where's the sacred temple prostitute who was by the road at Enam?" But they said, "Hey, there's no sacred prostitute there." So he returned to Judah and said, "Hey, I didn't find her, and the men of the place that there is no sacred temple prostitute there." Whoops! Judah is caught in a little bit of a lie. He apparently told his friend, look for the Kodesh. There is no Kodesh there. There's only a Zonah. And so Judah said, let her keep them for herself. She can keep my staff, cord, and seal, or else we might become a laughingstock. Look, I sent this goat, but you didn't find her. What does that mean? Judah has just basically told his friend, okay, don't say this, don't tell anybody about this, we'll just cover it up. Shh, we'll move on. And he thinks, just, had a fling with a little, street prostitute no one will ever know. Well, verse 24, 3 months later, Judah was told, hey, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, is acting like a common whore. She got pregnant from her whoring. So Judah said, bring her out and burn her. Judah doesn't care about her. He found out that she had got pregnant somehow. Kill her. This is where the deception on him comes to full fruition. As she was being brought out, though, she sent something to her father-in-law. You know what it is. And she said, I got pregnant by the man whose things these are. Please, do you recognize these? Oh. Whose seal, cord, and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I am. All this happened because I didn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her ever again. So what's going on here? Long story short, Judah, the man who masterminded the selling of Joseph and who masterminded the deception of his father with goat's blood, with the goat, and the phrase, recognize this, he gets deceived himself with Tamar, his daughter-in-law. He offers her a goat. It's involved in the deception. And when she sends his stuff back to him, she too says, recognize this. And at this point, this kind of marks the turning point in Judah's life. He does recognize them, and this phrase that she is more righteous than I, he's not applauding her for acting like a prostitute, but he realizes that he had put her in that position where she had no life left, and so she did what she needed to do to get her life back. And so the very fact that he acknowledges this marks a turning point in his life. The horrible Judah, who masterminded this whole thing, the deception of his father, he gets deceived as well by the phrase, recognize this. And he basically then takes her back into his household to care for her, but he does not know her again. But he does his responsibility as a father-in-law. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. When she was giving birth, one stretched out his hand, and the midwife took it, tied scarlet to his hand, and said, this one came out first. But then his hand went back in. That's kind of creepy. And look, his brother came out. So she said, my, oh my, haven't you broken through a breach? And so his name was called Perez. The name Perez means to break through a breach. After that, his brother, who had the scarlet on his hand, came out. His name was called Zerah. Zerah means dawning. But the story here is very telling. The story of Judah and Tamar is not just some random story thrown in the middle of a narrative. It's vital to the beginning of that narrative and to the character of Judah. Because long story short, Judah's the one who masterminded the deception of his father. By the end of the Joseph story, and you know the Joseph story, when they're in Egypt and Joseph basically frames his younger brother Benjamin and threatens to imprison Benjamin for stealing the cup, it's his brother Judah, who ends up offering his own life on behalf of Benjamin. And so by the end of the Joseph story, we realize why that story of Judah and Tamar is there at the beginning. Because Judah, the one who started that deception, because he's so heartless and horrible, he has a change of heart. He changes his life around. So where at the end of the Joseph story, he is the one who offers his life for the other son of Rachel, Benjamin. And that hastens the reunion between Joseph and his brothers and Jacob. And so chapter 38 is not some random story thrown into the Joseph narrative. It's a vital part of the narrative that shows a lot of things. It reveals something about Reuben. It reveals a whole lot about Judah, and obviously the whole inner workings there. And so therefore the Joseph cycle, the Joseph narrative, isn't just about Joseph and eventually how they all got to Egypt, but it also is something about Judah as well. And Judah is obviously an important figure because later it's the line of royal kings comes through the line of Judah's descendants. And so this story is really all about Judah as well, about his horrible sin and his redemption in a way, to where then he offers his life as well. It's a very interesting story. Well, anyway, next time, I think I'm going to take you through another common story that people know about, the story of Jonah. I did a master's thesis on it, and it is a fascinating piece of narrative that I'm going to take you through over the next few weeks, and I hope you enjoyed that. But hopefully, you've enjoyed this walk through most of Genesis, and we'll see you a little later.